Thank you very much for that survey into some of the themes that have marked Etienne Balibar's work all along. I think written into the script, the delinking of citizenship from any transparent or any self-evident notion of identity, the multiplication of levels of citizenship, civic, social, economic, cultural, constitutional, the rule of governance by fear with the populist politics and basing really their entire control of the social field on this fear. The difficulties, the complications of the European constitution debate. And in this country, I think we have a European forum in the Center for the Humanities in the hope that we can actually reopen the discussion. There is practically no public debate of any positive, constructive mode, it seems to me, in the Netherlands today, and I wonder why that is, and I wonder how you want to react to this.
Thank you a lot for your very clear analysis of the situation. I must confess I not very often heard such a clear description of the situation of Europe nowadays. And I especially agree that the topic of social rights is a very crucial topic for the possibilities of identification of Europe, and I as well agree with your topic concerning the perspective of a federal system. But there's a crucial problem with that. To create a constitution means you want to have specific things away from the political agenda. You want to settle them in the very structure of what it means to have the political arena. In order to achieve that, there's a specific problem. If you now say, in order to create a Europe as a democracy, we have some future and we have some stability and things like that, we need the perspective of a federal system and social rights. It's very predictable that you will have very different answers in Europe to that. So there are several states which will say, yes, that's our idea. There are some states, and for sure Great Britain would be someone, but there are others who would strictly disagree. So the attempt of the Constitution and the constitutional process was to take care that the Constitution was described in the way that all those things which are still on the political agenda are not settled in the Constitution but hold in the political process. If you come with your proposal, and if you are right, that the possibility of a democratic Europe is crucially linked with those 2 points, then you will force Europe to make a decision by forehand. And this decision must be either you go in the direction of a federalist system or finish the whole story with Europe. If you will formulate the question like that, the result is predictable. How do you think about it? I mean, I do not propose in Europe, be honest with yourself and split. Yeah? There are the ones who want to go in your direction and the others who don't. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea, but that's a consequence.
How do we proceed? Do I take several questions in a row, or? Yes, that's less risky.
Less risky.
I would like to know a little bit more about your affirmative notion of democracy. On the one hand, you problematize European democracy. On the other hand, you have a very strong affirmative notion of democracy that focuses on the positive side of conflict as a medium through which, to put it loosely, we can get to know aspects of ourselves that remain hidden in power constellations that democracy can break open, to say it very generally, I would say. But then, and you call this kind of an agonistic conception of democracy. But now there are a lot of different conceptions of what agonistic democracy may be about. You mentioned MOVE sometimes. For MOVE, it is basically about a power struggle between groups. And individuals are politically most strong when they are organized in groups, and institutions play a role to give these groups certain voice. But it is in a way a very disciplined conception of democracy that is behind that. On the other side, in agonistic camps, you have the Nietzscheans and the Foucauldians, who are much more unruly in their ideals of democratic politics, and in which politics is maybe more about, let's say, caring and coming to know aspects of the self that remain hidden when they are not, when certain power constellations are not criticized. Now, you already stressed that democracy has many faces, etc., but I would like to know a little bit more specific if you would say, just look, there are a lot of different ways in which democracy can become agonistic, and they are all good, or are there variants that are actually dangerous and that should be kept in check by a rule of law, for instance? Because I would stress that we in the Netherlands have learned in the last couple of years that democracy is not all good and very dangerous in some of its populist guises that are also very much befriended with the idea of conflict. So that's my, well, not my question, but my, I don't know, observation.
And thank you for introducing this concept of democratizing democracy, which I think not only applies to Europe, but I think applies to any functioning or dysfunctional democracy in the world that we have today. So we have to see it also as a term, I think, or a useful term for broader debates than the European one. The problem that I have with it is more a pragmatic or a practical issue, which is that democracy requires a demos. And democracy, at least as far as I understand it, has largely been historically generated or successfully generated through an uprising of a particular disenfranchised group. Traditionally we used to call it the word class, but it is with some sort of disenfranchisement which desires to be enfranchised. Now, if this is how we understand democracy, we can also say that the top-down, the dirigist model of democracy, has been less successful, at least, in the sense that of imposing a democracy upon a group that does not identify itself as wanting to be enfranchised by the people who are offering it the franchise. So there seems to be a connection, not necessarily with the identity, but at least with a struggle for enfranchisement or for rights, generally. The question is, where is the people in Europe who you are going to democratize their democracy? And it seems to me that what you suggest, and I think it's absolutely right, is that you say the democratization of Europe needs to be discussed within and across borders. Borders presumably of Europe, I would also suggest importantly borders outside of Europe. The problem is, what are the forums, or the forums, that are going to be able to conduct those discussions? Because we do not have, if we look traditionally at 20th century developments in democracy, we do not have political parties, which would be the traditional resort for those discussions to take place, which exist across borders. Nor do I think we have an academic discourse across borders which is effective given its instrumentalization by capital. We also have an extremely marginalized, at least in Europe, a very marginalized cultural activist community. Certainly since 2001, since Geneva and Seattle and the various demonstrations.
I just missed one word in your last sentence, which makes it impossible for me. Can you repeat it? You also not have one?
We do not have, at least within Europe, I don't think, significant, let me say.
No, say it again, just.
Sorry, significant groups of cultural activist groups. And I'm thinking here about, for instance, Genova and the anti or alternative globalization movements, which have since 2001 been relatively effectively silenced in Europe. So therefore, the problem that I see with this noble aim is the lack of a demos and the lack of the possibility to create a demos in which that uprising and demand for enfranchisement could be satisfied.
Now I find myself before all the only two obvious insoluble problems. But I want more than ever to stick to the situation of the position of somebody who wants to raise issue, discuss their formulation with others, but certainly not propose solutions or mottos. And I would be extremely pleased if you agreed with me that to reach a certain degree of clarity and agreement, I would say, on the nature of certain problems is perhaps the most we can achieve, but already something. Okay. Marcus raises the issue of the meaning in which I take the category constitution. I, of course, deeply regret not to be a legal theorist myself. And, of course, this is not a place or moment for a confession my past sins that I'm trying to. But the fact is that I had been intellectually molded, so to speak, formed in a tradition, and this does not only apply to Marxists, absolutely not. Which minimized or despised the importance of legal institution structures and debates. So this, of course, from my own point of view, is entirely a change today, and the debate on the possibility of constituting Europe and the fact that within this debate, in fact, all the traditional categories and assumptions of constitutional right or constitutional theory are set again in motion, I would say, has been an essential part of that. Now, I should probably agree that the dominant representation of what a constitution or a constitutional system means, say in the Kelsenian tradition, which is a democratic tradition, practically amounts at drawing a line of demarcation between two categories of issues. Those which are neutralized, so to speak, or depoliticized, and those which remain at stake in political conflicts and controversies. So, from this point of view, of course, the latent or not so latent debate around the situation of social rights in the European Constitution or draft Constitution was extremely significant. And I thank you for agreeing with me on the importance that I believe is obvious. And now that we discuss populism, of course, it's more clearly the case than ever. So I don't agree with a certain left critique of the draft constitution, which explained that the Constitution was actually sacralizing or incorporating at the level of the principles themselves pure notions of liberal or neoliberal economic and social policy. I think it was more complicated than that. But certainly it was a crucial decision, a political decision, on which most of the political forces and parties, if you like, behind the project had agreed not to include certain basic social rights in the draft project, which at the very minimal level meant that they should remain disputed or contested, a matter of conjunctural choices. And this, I believe, was one of the elements of regression, or at least non-progression with respect to the most advanced national constitutions in Europe. To suggest that the incorporation of ex-socialist countries into the European construction could have been the occasion of a fundamental debate on the very nature and function of social rights and the extent to which they belong to the individual or impose state disciplines and constraints is probably something which will sound crazy. But in fact, I think that we pay the price for not raising these issues in a sufficiently explicit and central manner. Now, in the end, I would probably want to question the idea that the line of demarcation can be drawn by any constitution in a clear and final manner, so to speak, between the issues that are political and the issues that are, say, juridical and politically neutral. This is the case because, in fact, when principles, notions of rights, for example, or powers, are explicitly included in something like a charter or a foundational text, they actually can be invoked either by groups or by individual citizens in the political debate. And in fact, I don't know if that was your point, but I would emphasize myself that any additional inscription of rights in something like a European charter does not diminish the possibilities of political debate and confrontation in the constituency, but on the contrary, increases it. So maybe you'll think that I have now suddenly become too much of a legal fan of legal dispositions. This is, of course, a matter of formulation and status. I found the idea of the Charter particularly important. In a sense, I regretted that it was drowned, so to speak, and perhaps that was the objective, in the middle of a monstrous fabrication, which in many cases established procedural rules and not constitutional principles. On the other hand, I profoundly lament the fact that what has been, and I'm not totally surprised, immediately or almost immediately sacrificed on the altar, I would say, of consensus and unanimity was precisely the constitutional value of the Charter as such. Okay, that's a little long and painstaking, painful even. But more about my affirmative notion of democracy and simultaneously, two other problems concerning different conceptions of conflictual, as I say myself, or agonistic democracy, and in the end, the idea that you raised that we in the Netherlands, excuse me, others as well, I mean, it's not a privilege of the Netherlands. Do we have an Italian in this? Do we have a French in this audience? Okay, not always good. Starting with the end, I will take the risk. It's a long, difficult, practical discussion. It's the heart of the issue concerning the crisis of politics in Europe today. Personally, I believe, you're not forced to agree with me, of course, that to draw the conclusion from this observation, the populist dangers involved in the very conflictual nature of democracy itself. To draw the conclusion that what we need is to be careful with democracy, to set up limits and constraints, restrictions upon political participation or the real power granted to the people, I mean, or their representatives, is pure and simply to abandon the possibilities of solving the problem. So I agree that there is a risk, but I think that the risk has to be confronted and opposed from the inside. Now you tell me like that, in the end, you'll have Hitler. That, of course, well, if you think that, you really think that Europe is in extreme danger. No, no, no. No. So, what I believe is, if we discuss politics, and if we take the risk of populism seriously, I was quoting Mouffe, but Laclau, for example, and others are trying to think on that issue. This, of course, means that our concept of democracy, and that leads to the question you raised at the beginning, must involve not only pluralism or even conflict, but also other essential dimensions. And this is why I would agree that that it's important to distinguish different concepts or different types of agonism. Of course, all the theorists and the thinkers and that you mentioned, and we might perhaps add even others, seem to be working. And I would say I myself, and probably many of us, are exactly in that situation, between two kinds of catastrophic extremes, and therefore hunting for an enigmatic gain that is perhaps mythical, in the form of neither nor, neither antagonism in the extreme forms, I said, civil war, to return to certain famous models, nor the tyranny of the consensus. I would personally suggest that what is lacking or is not yet explicit in a formal definition of democracy as agonism is a more concrete representation of capabilities of the citizens themselves. I very much agree not only with, again, this is something that I would not have said like that perhaps in the past, not only with the word, but with the idea behind the word capability as it is used, for example, by somebody like Amartya Sen. What I find interesting in such a notion, which combines many different elements, economic certainly, social, but also cultural and educational, is that it aims at bridging the gap between the rights and the powers of the individuals and the rights and the powers of the groups to whom they belong. So it is in that sense that I am trying, and I believe others as well, to reflect on what I call expanding powers or forms of empowerment of the citizen, which in the end would hypothetically bring in a possibility to regulate the conflict, not only from outside, that is through state and juridical constraints, but from the inside of the political life itself, so to speak, give a certain matter and material reality to the notion of a self-regulating conflict. But there are many, and from that point of view, if you ask me to choose, I find myself more on the side of Foucault than on the side of Mouffe, precisely because she is more statist and is more, if you like, cultural and social. But on the other hand, I think Mouffe is right to stress the fact that what is at stake is a political form. Maybe something that she inherited from a certain Gramscian notion of expanding or expansive democracy. And in the end, you might retaliate or retort, and I don't know if this is what you are tempted to do, that I have simply pushed the difficulty one step further. That is, hypothesizing practical forms of democratic life that precisely become fragilized and threatened when the hydra of populism raises its ugly head. And finally, on trying to reply something not too stupid to Charles's question, which I absolutely agree cannot be avoided. I think that, well, it seems to me that you raised the issue in two successive forms, and in a sense, the second formulation that you proposed, although it in the end proposes or yields a very pessimistic conclusion. I'm looking around, I'm desperately trying to see the forces, the multiple forces whose interventions, struggles, insurrections in the general sense could, so to speak, materially or dynamically represent this demos without which there is no democracy, and I don't see them. But you don't see them, but you mention, you give a list. So the issue might be something like, are all these subjects, these collective subjects, some of which are institutional, other more spontaneous, etc., absolutely dead and hopeless, including the parties, of course. Many of us, I tend to believe, at least myself, are or have been desperately looking for initiatives coming from political parties in the most traditional sense in Europe, which would at last, I would not say abolish the borders, but dialectically transgress their limitations and work, in fact, with the political problem they pose. And one of the reasons why I say we, you understand, maybe but I don't believe I'm the only one, are so disappointed, for example, with European socialist and social democratic parties is not the fact that they had divergences, but that they proved, in fact, unable to transform their divergences into a single debate, while they apparently at least had some of the formal conditions needed for that. Now, returning to the beginning and stopping there, the demos. I don't know if I'm right in hearing between your formulation something that is akin, is rather converging with, for example, Jacques Rancière's formulations. And as much as I find that his intervention has been decisive, because precisely, instead of taking the double meaning of the classical duality or duplicity of the category demos as an embarrassment, he transformed it into an active and effective way of reflecting on precisely the infinite character of democracy. The reason why, if you don't progress, you regress. Now, this being said, I think that there is a sort of fascination in Rancière that is there, like it was in Arendt. He doesn't like Arendt, I believe, because he's in fact sharing the same prejudices on some issues. So, sort of fascination for the Greek model, for the ancient model, where the duality of the duplicity, apparently at least that's our political and philosophical tradition, works in the following manner. Either the mass, the poor, the demos in the sense of populace is excluded. And then, of course, what is called democracy is simply an oligarchy or a system of privileges. Or it becomes included, which, of course, is not what the what political theory traditionally described as a monster that is the almighty populace invading the political arena, but something more crucial and more fundamental than that, the generalization precisely and the universalization of the category of the citizen, which is permanently a matter of struggle. But the danger in sticking to that model, in my opinion, is precisely that you think exclusion you represent exclusion in terms of that kind of alternative. A certain group is inside or is outside the political system. And this also is one of the reasons why I find it important to discuss exactly in which sense certain category of residents in today's Europes and nations are excluded. You have a tendency to see that as a sort of permanent repetition of the same pattern. There was the pletors or the plebs, the poor in the ancient cities. Then you had the proletariat in modern nations, and now you have the immigrants. Include them instead of excluding them from the polity, and the demos will, so to speak, materialize. I tend to believe myself, like you did in the second part of your intervention, that what matters is not simply the identity of the group, but the quality of the struggles that develop around issues of exclusion and inclusion, and more generally, of course, rights, powers, forms of justice, etc.
Thank you.